Good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Molnar. I'm an associate research scientist at UMTRI, and I'm also the associate director of the Atlas Center, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this next session on longitudinal research on aging drivers, or the LongROAD study. And this is actually the first part of a two-part session on the LongROAD study, which is a multi-state cohort study of aging drivers that's being sponsored by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. And so we're very pleased to have a number of the investigators from this study from the various sites who are going to be talking about the study. So our first speaker is Lindsay Ryan, who's going to be presenting on behalf of Jackie Smith, who was unfortunately unable to be here today. Dr. Ryan is an associate research scientist at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. She's going to be talking about the driving for life, age, context, and implications for life quality. So please help me welcome Dr. Ryan.
All right, again, I apologize on behalf of Jackie Smith, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here this morning. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We're just setting up the context for why the LongROAD study is such an important and sort of integral study for understanding drivers as they age, just with some background information. So, you know, we've heard a lot about transportation and driving in particular this morning. We know that across age, the ability to drive, particularly in a country like the US where there is such sprawl and not always access, like Arlington, amazing, to public transportation, that the ability to drive and access to cars and driving allows people to do daily tasks such as grocery shopping, allows people to interact socially with people in their network. We have pictures of Michigan tailgating here, allows you to engage in the leisure activities that might be of interest to you, and then also allows you to do things that are necessary, such as doctor's appointments and other necessities. So again, it provides access. It's a very important factor for adults really across the age, but you know, we're in particular interested in how these things play out for older adults. So, you know, driving is more than just access. It is, in many cases, a sense of independence, and it has an important role in how sometimes people see their identity. My grandfather loved driving. They lived in a suburban neighborhood, and he and my grandmother would just drive around for a day and go to some of their favorite places. He didn't necessarily have anywhere to go, but he knew that he had the ability to get around and do the things that he enjoyed doing. The act of driving was a very important part of who he believed he was as a person. And it's almost a sense of pride that you're still able to engage in this activity as you age. And so, you know, there is quite a bit of evidence now that in addition to supplying access to many of the activities that are important for health and subjective well-being, driving on its own as an activity is an important source of happiness and satisfaction in older adults in particular. And thinking about driving outcomes, various outcomes, it's not just the act of driving that's important, but also thinking about the impact of cessation of driving. It can have very important impacts on as we know, for mobility for people that do not have access to public transport. And you know, from Jackie's perspective and some of the work I do looking at well-being, it also has very important impacts on how you perceive your life and the amount of positive and negative affectivity that you're feeling in your days and on sort of a global scale. So if you no longer are able to drive or no longer have access to a car, you know, we argue there's pretty important implications for the subjective well-being of many older adults. So this is just some very sort of descriptive data from the Health and Retirement Study, which is a large U.S. national sample that I spend most of my time working on. And it was a study, it's a longitudinal study not designed to study driving, but it has some driving information. And so this is data from 2012. And of all those in the 65 plus age range in this sample, they get asked a few driving questions. So of the 9,500 participants in our sample who are 65 or older in that wave, about 78% said they're still able to drive, 22% said no. Of those who say they don't currently drive, 9% never drove. That's my other grandmother who could never pass her test and just gave up in her 20s and just never drove. She has a fleet of children and grandchildren to take her around. 65% say they no longer drive, so they have stopped driving, meaning they were at one point driving. And then another, about a quarter of them said that they haven't driven in the last month. So maybe they're not at the point where they would say that they have totally stopped driving, but they're probably somewhere along that spectrum. Now, of the more than 3/4 who said they are still driving, you see that about a third of them identify that they're limiting their trips to be short and around town, close, short drives. Whereas, another 2/3 of them would say that they're still making the regular long trips that maybe they would have been making prior to age 65. But when you look at these factors in more fine-grained age detail, we get an even more interesting story. So in this graph here, we have it blocked off by age decade, so 65, or age, it looks like 5-year age periods here. So you can see the 60s, early 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and then 85 plus. This is just the proportion of people in each of those age groups who either say they've never driven, who don't drive. You can see the proportions that say they don't drive go up with age, as do the proportions who say they haven't driven in the past month. And then, driving long trips also looks quite, there's quite an age gradient there. So again, you can see there's some sort of regulatory behaviors. Perhaps these older adults, as they're getting into the middle old and the old, as those ages were defined earlier this morning, are starting to scale back some of their driving. Perhaps it's linked to some of these perception issues that we were hearing about this morning as well. So we can see that there are definitely some age-graded differences. But in terms of how the ability or the feeling that you're able to drive is related to your subjective well-being, again, in our data we find that just looking at those people that say they can drive and those that say they can't, there's quite a significant difference in how satisfied they are overall with their lives. And again, this is over and above functional limitations and other demographic characteristics. So there is something about driving that is important for older adults. So with all of this in mind, the LongROAD study is hugely important, and in the next 2 sessions, I feel very privileged to be a part of this study. In the next 2 sessions, we're going to hear quite a lot about the design of the study, the genesis of the study, and many of the different components. It's in the U.S., there really isn't a large longitudinal study that is specifically tailored to look at older drivers while they're still driving to understand what factors are most essential to safe driving, as well as what's predicting those individuals who are going to eventually stop driving. And it's the potential of LongROAD study and all the really amazing diverse data that we're collecting that we're going to talk about later that's really going to answer a lot of these questions and fill a lot of these gaps. So, the hope is, and Jackie designed this this figure at the bottom here, that with this study, with this very detailed prospective study, we're going to be able to incorporate information about the actual vehicles people are using, a lot of information about the drivers themselves, individual characteristics, their context in which they're living, see what sort of factors make a good fit between vehicle and individual, and how all of these different contextual pieces play an important role for safe and hopefully extended mobility in the older population. So I'm going to leave, I think that's the last slide, I'm going to leave it at that, and then I'll be back in the afternoon session.